Alrighty, well, I think we can go ahead and get started. So once again, thank you guys for being here. This is the Purpose-Driven Portfolio. We have some wonderful panelists today who are being led by Kelly Brucher. She's the Business Development Manager for Herman Miller. But first off, want to go ahead and, as always, give a big thank you to our IIDA SoCal 2021, chapter sponsors that our patron level, donor, friend, and obviously our design partners, AECOM, Gensler, HOK, Oculus, and Walcott. We really couldn't do these events without all of your guys' support. A big special thank you to our event sponsors for today, both BKM and Smith Group. We really appreciate the time and commitment that you guys have with IIDA making these events possible. I'd like to introduce our moderator today, Kelly Brucher. She has 10 years of experience within the commercial furniture industry. She's got a strong passion for research-based design within a workplace and helps clients understand how people work and what workplace settings can really best support them throughout the day. Resulting in high-performance workplace that hopefully helps organizations achieve their goals. Her portfolio covers tenant improvement projects for startups with 50 people to complete ground up new builds for global companies with over 5,000 employees. So Kelly, thank you so much for being here today and moderating this discussion. I'm very happy and excited to be able to kick it off to you.
Yeah, thank you, Elliot. We are definitely excited. We have a great group of panelists with us today. To sort of discuss everything that you need to know around creating the best portfolio. So without further ado, I will introduce our panelists here. First on the left, we have Megan Woodcock. Megan is the founder and creative director of Beta Minus here in San Diego. And she comes to us with a wealth of knowledge. Prior to moving to San Diego, she spent over a decade as faculty at the interior design department of Savannah College of Art and Design. So welcome, Megan. We also have Bill Boucher. So Bill is the principal director of design at HOK in LA. So he brings us over 25 years as a thought leader in the design industry. And he is famous. His work has appeared in Interior Design Magazine, Contract Magazine, and the New York Times, among a few others. Welcome, Bill. And then lastly, but not least, Ashley Casatelli. So Ashley is an associate and senior interior designer at Smith Group here in San Diego. And she comes to us with over 14 years experience spanning across the country from Seattle to New York and now here in San Diego. So welcome, Ashley. All right. Well, we will go ahead and get started here. So again, the chat is open. So if anyone has questions, comments, feel free to drop them in the chat and Elliot and I will be watching and can chime in as necessary. So our first question that is top of mind today is going to be really discussing the benefits between a portfolio website versus a physical portfolio when really telling your design story. So, Mr. Bill, would you like to kick it off for us?
Well, right. So here we are interviewing candidates during the pandemic and possibly pandemic transition time, right? So there are a couple of benefits, right? So number one, we certainly like to receive certain types of hard copy work. However, these days it has to be mailed at home and often shared. So PDFs, electronic versions are great. Websites are wonderful. But one of the things that websites don't always allow us to see is the broader process. And so if you're on an interview and you're looking at that on a WebEx, Zoom, right, Teams call, typically screen sharing is kind of critical to someone talking to or hosting the journey of taking us through their work. And so one of the things we've been asking candidates up front about is whether or not they have other platforms as addition to that. And I specifically think of things like concept board, Miro board, right? Two kind of examples for a virtual whiteboard where the work is shared more Scrum style and laid out in a smackdown type of space, because the regions can organize projects and it allows a more collaborative way to connect, and it can become more relaxed. So there's a combination of all those things that we're kind of looking for. We do like to see writing examples and certain rendering examples in hard copy as well, just to get a feel for that. And we're always open for looking at thumbnails, storyboards, and sketches, easily scanned, included in a website portfolio, but those are critical.
Wonderful. Ladies, any addition to Bill?
Yeah, I think what's really important is understanding that, you know, every job you're applying to has a different culture, has a different way that they work together. So not trying to create a one size fits all solution for all these, you know, the jobs you may be applying to, knowing that the more jobs you apply to, the better chance you have of actually landing a job. Think about your audience. Who are you sending it to? What kind of message are you trying to send them? If it's a really innovative and the website of that company is really forward thinking with videos and you know, virtual communication, it might benefit you to really kind of promote that in your own portfolio style. So I think that diversity and understanding what kind of job you're looking for, what kind of firms you're applying to, and then thinking through what really applies. I know pre-COVID, one of the things with our team, we really were a very collaborative effort when it came to reviewing portfolios. So before we even got to the interview point, we would be printing out PDFs typically. So each person in the office could kind of look through it, comment, make markups. And on a website, you just can't do that same interaction. But of course, now we're doing it more virtually, so we can kind of navigate those websites together a little bit easier. So I think ultimately there's not a best solution. It's just kind of know what it is that's your sweet spot and play to that sweet spot.
Interesting. I like that. So tailoring specific to the different firm. Yeah, I couldn't imagine reviewing a portfolio, I guess, and trying to mark it up when it's all digitally or marking it up. Cool.
Well, I think Katie's on point, right? Because in the hopes that we do return to the office in some form or fashion, perhaps the end of this year, one of the things that we miss is that we often liked the ability when a candidate came in to say to them, take the table, spread it out, because very often what is important is to see concurrent, consecutive, and multiple images and visuals at the same time, because we're often looking for the seeds in the early work that might be played out in development of more developed portions of schematic, renderings, detailing, photography. And so we're kind of looking where the common threads might be, or how seeds get planted in the discovery of a project and then play out in the development in a story that unpacks throughout the entire project typology. So we're always looking for that kind of thing. We miss being able to say to people, take it out, spread it out, and take the table.
Right, which you just can't do, like you guys already mentioned, with a website or with a tablet, right? If you think about how many people are going to be in the interview, speaking to Ashley's point, kind of reading the room, knowing your audience, and having, I think, just covering both bases and having both options depending upon what the interview is requiring.
Yeah, definitely. Once you get to that interview process, I've been on interviews where all of a sudden all the conference rooms are taken for clients. And so we end up in a corner somewhere and there is no AD screen, there is no capability. So if I didn't bring a laptop or a tablet, then I've got nothing to show. So being prepared and having some print material is always a good backup. Even if your main portfolio is gonna be virtual or gonna be digital, having some sort of backup to speak to your process and your passion is going to be critical, because you just don't know what you're going to walk into oftentimes.
That's such a good point. Contingency plan.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah.
We have to do it in the real world too with our clients. So get used to it.
Awesome. Well, kind of leading off of what Bill had talked about with hand sketches, I wanted to dive into really how you feel the important ways to incorporate those hand-drawn, dirty mess types of sketches versus including, polished digital work. How do you make sure there's a good ratio?
Well, I'll jump in. We usually look for it up front. So typically, right, we're receiving an electronic version of a resume, a bio. Maybe it's a page about the person what inspires them. And then there's the work, the body of work that's represented in some type of portfolio. If we don't see iterative, sketch-like, thumbnail type work, we ask for it. Can it be scanned? Can it be sent as a separate PDF? Can you update us on it? But I think for us, we really like to be able to say to a candidate, if you have that as an upfront engine to the beginning of the story you tell of an individual project, it's kind of important us to try to make the visual connections between that scruff work and how it looks as it's developed in planning, in elevation, in section, and the three-dimensionality views that come from thumbnails that might become more Revit-based views that then become rendered in some fashion. We're looking for common threads, seeds, storytelling that builds upon things that were extracted, that start with all the discovery type activities, played out to the littlest of detail on the corner of a finished photograph.
I think sometimes it's scary to be vulnerable. I remember like I had a few in my portfolio back in the day, but you want to show everything pretty and polished and finished. And sometimes it's hard to be open enough to show the, messy, unperfect part of how the design process works.
That stuff is so critical, right? I mean, that's really where the inner workings of your brain come through. A lot of times final renderings can look the same from one person to the next because we're all kind of using the same technology to get there. So even though we hope that our design ideas are going to shine through in those beautiful renderings that we spend so much time on, it's really those sketches and process drawings and things that are, in my opinion, even more beautiful than the final renderings. It's funny how I think that changes from being a student to being in the real world as you learn to sort of look at things a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think both of you guys, all you guys have kind of hit the nail here. I think what it comes down to is really about the process and the design decision making, right? We want to see that there's a clear process from your big idea to how that lands into a final design decision. If we're just seeing the final design, it's very hard to assess why you made some of those decisions, what the basis of those decisions are. So those sketch drawings, those research material that talk to some of those design decisions or concept imagery really help support that final beautiful rendering. But ultimately we're not looking for the most beautiful outcome, right? As designers, we are looking for design solutions that meet our clients' needs. So to see that in a portfolio is going to put you a leg up because we can see sooner that, oh wow, this is someone who can really think through a design problem and come up with a solution that's thoughtful and meaningful.
I mean, Ashley, I think what you're really hitting on here, right, is what we're talking about is, from a storytelling standpoint, is really the cartoon set, right? We really want to see exploration as expressed in thinking in the way something evolves, whether it's red marked and crossed up and crinkled, or with an arrow drawn to like another view and something highlighted with a highlighter or a color pencil line. It talks about pivot, change, transformation, and development, right? And so it's kind of like peeling the layers off an onion. But the other thing is that how often are we in a meeting, team meeting, and say, okay, who's going to storyboard, cartoon set, SD1, SD2, DD1, and DD2? So even if you have, and I like to do it on grid paper, a very quick sketch that numbers out and lists what the major visual elements are, it's an ability to quickly put in front of a group of people a way of doing something. And while we're obviously doing it with InDesign and Excel, and we're working on Photoshop and we're on concept board doing it, sometimes a sketch very quickly knocked out and numbered attached to an email can achieve something in 30 minutes that might take somebody 2 hours to block out. But the importance, I think, is that it be iterative to get group input and then be revised, because ultimately some of that's going to be extracted and end up as an agenda. It's going to end up being the guide or the look ahead to each step of the design process so that you're workshopping it all the way through.
Interesting. So have you seen any clever ways that people have told their story in a portfolio using, if it is thumbnails of napkin sketches, trace paper? What are some interesting ways you've seen that laid out to tell a story?
We didn't see this in the portfolio, but when we went back to a recent candidate and asked about the process, because we were interviewing a candidate, They were large projects. They were buildings on campuses with interiors. So what were we looking at? We're looking at someone who has master planning, urban planning, building and massing, and then having some qualitative definition of the interior experience. They ended up sending us 2 PDFs that were compilations of Bluebeam team sessions where, to Ashley's point and Megan's comment, images were loaded. People were PDFing and putting up 3M sticky notes. You saw Bluebeam notes in red and blue for different authors. So we were like, because we wanted to know that they were nimble with the technology, the tools, but that they had a comfort level about being in a collaborative process where probably somebody or 1 or 2 people were kind of giving senior oversight. I think that is a critical thing to demonstrate about work in progress, because it tells us immediately that person can step into a team session virtually in this way and participate with the tools and the means.
Mm-hmm. To speak to the physical portfolio, some interesting ways to present process would be, I've seen like a vellum overlay series where individual is walking somebody through the sort of entire space planning or 3-dimensional iteration process. So flipping through annotations, arrows, as Bill said, all those things where you're pivoting and changing ideas. So that comes across really nice. Sometimes process, Kelly, you were mentioning that it can be kind of vulnerable to put your stuff on paper and it doesn't look very good. But sometimes it's just the paper, right? If you switch to vellum or if you keep it on trace, it really brings its original self to life. So I've seen that vellum fold outs. And then Bill just mentioned photos of process, and this works really well for students too. I remember when I was teaching and students would just fill their spaces with all of their trace paper and models and stuff like that. That takes beautiful photos. And again, you can't recreate it, right? For a portfolio, you can't lay it out in the same way, but making sure that you're taking time to document all that mess, your desk, any time in the project where you're just thinking and generating all this stuff, take photos, and that will look really beautiful, both in an online portfolio as well as a physical portfolio.
That's a great tip, because I think as you're, for students or as you're doing the process, it's like crumple up, throw it, like
Yes.
you forget to take a moment and,
Yes.
and document it.
Yes.
And
it's hard to recreate.
I wish I knew that.
Yes, I know. It's so beautiful. I'm thinking back to some of the most amazing just messes that lived in studio for weeks and weeks on end.
Very cool.
Yeah, one of the things that I think, again, and this speaks to sort of that flexibility and the people that you're going to be applying to, so the different firms, is the folks that kind of cater their portfolio or set up their portfolio where, a particular project, you might have 10 projects that you want to document that are a range of your experience from school or professional experience. Mm-hmm. But when you go into your interview or when you submit to a firm, you probably only need 5 or 6 of those max, right? Because you don't want to overwhelm your panelists. They're going to lose interest after, 3 projects, perhaps 4. Mm-hmm. So being able to setting up your portfolio so that you're able to kind of pull things out and in. So I've seen people with kind of like almost like pamphlets or booklets for each different type of project, or if they're talking about a personal interest of like graphic design work that they've done, they have a certain section where they can pull those things in and out as needed for a particular client. So maybe the firm you're applying for does mostly hospitality and maybe a little bit of workplace. So maybe with that firm, you want to really cater those types of projects to that firm versus one of the larger firms where they kind of really cover all the different disciplines. And so maybe you want to showcase a little bit of those different disciplines, whether it's workplace and, higher ed or, hospitality. So I've seen that as a really clever way to personalize your portfolio for a particular audience as well.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. So I feel like on the topic of personalizing, I know right now we have to kind of think outside the box, especially if you're applying for, jobs and positions right now. I heard a few stories when we met earlier about some clever interactive tools that people have used, perhaps on their website, including videos of themselves. Do you have any examples of something that might have struck your interest that you've seen?
We saw what was really interesting. It relates a little bit. Ashley and Megan are going to like this. So we had a recent candidate. We had 3 thumbnail sketches as the cover to each project, right?
Mhm.
And I think this person, and this was an intermediate level professional. So we wondered if they'd been through some type of discussions that led to that, right? But there were the 3 sketches that were like the big ideas, the aha moments, right? Seeing those and having access to them gave us access to a conversation where we really wanted to understand what those sketches explored, not what they represented, right? So more the why than the what it was, right? So that was interesting. So it further back in the portfolio, which was electronic, we saw them dissolve. And there was a dissolve vehicle used between each of the pages. So as you went from sketches, you saw a program statement. As it dissolved from program statement, it came back in the PowerPoint to then being a floor plan, but it was the context of the building. Then it evolved again and we saw the detail of the plan, and then it moved into rendering. So there was a transmission, so to speak, and a dissolve that was used to transition each of the components of the presentation. And it helped kind of give it a sense of reveal, right? And progressive disclosure. So that is the most sophisticated example we've seen. The other example of just seeing sketches as the opener says this person's willing to show messy work, and they're really understanding that we want to know why as opposed to what, right? We can see what it is. We want to know why it became that.
Interesting.
Yeah, in terms of, you know, I'm not sure exactly if this is your question, but, you know, there's different software now that sort of allows a little bit more of that agility. So Prezi, mural board, right? You're able to kind of show that a little bit more. So those are interesting tools to try to capture your work and make those dynamic transitions. But definitely with those types of decisions in your portfolio, I think it's really important to make sure it's software you really understand and that it does put your best foot forward. You know, a lot of times, you know, you may think, oh, this is going to be so cool. I want to show this, you know, great trick or tip in my portfolio. You don't really know what you're doing and you kind of fumble through it and it works and it's exciting. But all of a sudden you've now sold a skill to a potential employer. So you just want to make sure that these decisions you're making are things that are part of who you are and a comfort zone for you, where you want to head, and tools that you feel comfortable using. I think we might talk about this a little bit more as well, but I did just want to pick up on that because, you know, Bill, you mentioned the idea that the most sophisticated example. So we just want to make sure that these examples we're showing we can back up.
Well, I think to build on that though, right? So you're to some degree, Kelly, you're asking us what we've seen about, say, animation and activation, right? And so I think particularly for interiors professionals who might be interviewing in firms that also are architecture, master planning, so multidiscipline, but are architecture based. So HOK, it's big A and it's big CI, right? Architecture, commercial interiors, they're both fairly heavily weighted. However, when an interiors candidate has taken a large scale project that has a big program, let's say it's 100, 200, 300,000 square feet, like a headquarters assignment, and has taken the time to figure out in Revit initially, and maybe into Rhino, how to take the massing chunks of interior space program that in an exploded view are outside the plan and then enter into the plan and lock themselves with a certain placement. It's a vehicle for talking about a very large scale planning strategy. It might be across multiple floor plates, but it really, really resonates with interior massing and programming being akin to architecture modeling. And I think that's something that all entry candidates should talk about, particularly to communicate the sensibilities that they are a three-dimensional thinking interior designer.
Mm-hmm. I was thinking actually, like in this COVID, you know, work from home world, a lot of times now we're using video of ourselves to communicate to our clients some type of design direction. So I had wondered if you had seen in any portfolios or if you recommend possibly as part of your website, you as yourself explaining, you know, what this design story might be to shed a little, you know, on your personality.
I haven't seen that come through. But it's an interesting idea because we all are getting more used to this virtual communication, right? Like you all are in my home, you're seeing my home, you're getting a whole different perspective of who I am as a person. And once we go back to the office, I think it's going to be hard to just turn that off. So I think there's something to that idea to kind of, you know, and it also will depend too on the setup. Like if you're interviewing, you know, I moved here from New York 2 years ago. And so most of my initial interviews were all video interviews. And so it's definitely a different format. So I think if it feels relevant for what you need to do, I think it's a really compelling, interesting idea to have some sort of personality, video, voiceover, whatever, something to go along with a portfolio submission perhaps. But I haven't seen that yet.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll see it in the near future.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, kind of talking on the topic of, you know, what else can you show in your portfolio to really show your personality, show other, you know, highlight other creative fields that you might really feel are part of your design inspiration in your interiors side. What do you all recommend? You know, have you seen obviously people show highlighting other hobbies, other fields of interest? How much of that can you include?
Kelly, I think that you kind of pointed out the main driver, which is that it's a part of you, right? I think that that's kind of the key, is that if it's really something that is a key part of your personality and sort of drives you as a person, as a designer, as an artist, then I think it's critical, right? We want to see if you're doing fibers or oil painting or an avid sketcher. I think though that sometimes in an effort to maybe be different or show some kind of range, it's sort of easy to maybe put stuff in there that's just one-offs, right? To sort of fill that gap. And I would say if that's the mindset that you have when you're doing it, like don't do it. You know, you don't have to put your fundamentals 3D artwork in there if you don't, unless it's really something that you're passionate about and has shaped and continues. You know, I think continuing to shape you in the present and moving forward is the check mark that you want to make sure that you fill before you move forward with those things.
That makes sense.
I think it's important. We look for it and we ask about it. I also think that if you're a candidate, one of the things that you're probably anticipating or that a firm might be expecting is for you to break the ice, open the conversation, because often the first question is, tell me about yourself. Why are you interested in X? How did you hear about us? What's your experience like, right? I think it's sometimes really great for a candidate to take the bull by the horns and say, let me share a little bit about myself. And our experience has been is that just like being on camera, right? It's a view into your life like Lashley talks about. So there's a lot more things that are acceptable on camera. People have been working from home with home as the background. And I think that's part of a movement about bringing it all back. And that when we do return to the office, that a lot of that, what's acceptable on camera, will also come into the workplace with it and with us, right? Which I think means more relaxed, more casual, more comfort with technology and the ability to use it in a more relaxed manner. But we really love to ask a candidate, what floats your boat? What do you like to do with your time? Does it or does it not relate to what you do in design, creation, craft making? Recent candidate came in and talked about her love for long distance biking and how for her, movement or travel from point A to point B, or journey as represented by her recreational activities with friends, was also about the way she thought about going through space. And so there was a relationship there. The counter relationship of it's a complete effort to just break away from creating space is an acceptable trajectory as well. We just want to know what it is.
Yeah, I love that idea of how our personal experiences shape our design thinking and our design process, and making that connection, I think is always really compelling to me when I see that in a portfolio, just from sort of a more kind of constructive and sort of where we are right now in the world. I also think it's an interesting dialogue to have in terms of talking about equity in the workplace and diversity, right? So we're all under the gun right now as companies trying to figure out our own personal unconscious biases, right? So what are we looking for now in portfolios so that we're not creating sort of a one-note office, right? So we're looking at ways to find diversity within our own hiring. And I think this is one of those great avenues where we can kind of gauge and see diversity within a portfolio to try to bring that into our office more. Of course, it's a catch-22 because if you talk about something that somebody just happens to like, oh, I hate bike riding or whatever it may be, that unconscious bias can always be a little tricky, but I think just that lens of trying to be more compassionate and trying to be, again, more diverse and equitable in our hiring practices. I think this is one of those things that could help a firm and a hiring board make some decisions about where do we need the diversity right now in the office.
So in terms of, pre-interview, just strictly portfolio, if it is, website or physical, is this a feature of the portfolio that you would recommend at the very beginning to really show who you are in your, creative interiors, paint, whatever, to catch their interest of you as an individual and then dive into your work? Or is this a closer at the end to...
I think it depends, right? I think when Bill made the point of leading with who you are, if the idea is that these different things shape that story, then visuals to support that, I think, are critical, right? If, however, you are as much of this type of artist or photographer or whatever as you are a designer, then it could be something that you have at the end of the portfolio so that you can dive into it if there's time, right? One thing I've seen is a bunch of this stuff put at the end, and then it becomes an afterthought, right? Oh, and I do this, and I do this, and I do this, right? And that's what you don't want to do. So I think the point is to really think about how is it going to shape you sharing with a potential employer who you are and what you're about, how much of that should be loaded up front. And then if there's time and it becomes relevant as you read the room, right? You might have stuff at the back that continues to support that well-rounded person that you are.
It's all about the storytelling, right?
Yes.
So what story is it that you want to tell about yourself? So that may be, I just quickly want to, this is a little bit about me, and that's right in the beginning. Obviously you don't want that to be your whole 30-minute, you want to be sensitive to how much time that is. For me personally, when I've done portfolios in the past, I have always loved photography, and photography, the lens of what I see in a camera really kind of helped me inform some of my design. And I would sprinkle that throughout and cater it to whatever kind of environment I was talking about. So I would correlate my personal interest of photography to thinking about design. So my personal story was integrated within my portfolio. It wasn't a forward, and it wasn't an afterthought. It was kind of throughout. But I think it really depends on what it is you're trying to communicate to your reviewers.
I want to see that. That sounds interesting. The photography like looped in as you go. I was into painting, so I had included watercolors in mine. That was kind of as I went. It felt more natural for me to sketch and watercolor than do the fancy polished renderings.
But Kelly, what's nice about your question, what's kind of beautiful about the way you're offering up that example and what Ashley and Megan are sharing is that it'd be great for candidates to be thinking of themselves as a tapestry, right? That there's richness in diversity in bringing it on, bringing your best person forward. HOK, like many other firms, has a long history of pro bono work. We do a lot of social outreach. And so we both ask our professionals to volunteer, but we also approach them and ask them to step up as well, so that we create a lot of involvement and then rotational involvement in what we do. And I think the last year of life everywhere in this country has really stepped that up. It's brought its awareness in a much more expansive way. And so we're taking advantage of that, and to the degree that we can, because we have practice areas that are in justice. We're looking at, we design facilities for incarcerated people, right? So if you think about the human experience and the way we're trying to improve that experience through the built environment, there's a deep connection to what kind of social outreach culture, programs, and volunteerism there is. And it really, I think, also contributes to the esprit de corps, the culture of an individual office. It's one of the components, it's one of the ingredients of that culture. And it's super important, not only for a candidate to want to talk about it, for a candidate to press us and say, what's your view and what's your position? What's the firm's trajectory like? How do you do that in the Los Angeles region from this particular studio? I think it's a two-way conversation, that one, and wants to be.
Interesting. So we have our first question from the group. So Caroline is asking, what do you recommend, how you tailor your portfolio if you're trying to switch into a new design sector? So I believe she might mean, like, if, let's say I'm a graphic artist and I might be moving, into interiors, or let's say I'm an industrial designer moving into interiors. If you don't have a ton of past work, how to really show your strength for that particular field.
This comes up a lot, I think, in my past with, candidates coming in and wanting to try to break into, whether it be, I've done healthcare my whole career and I really want to go into hospitality or, whatever, or if it's from graphic design to interiors or even real estate, right? I think we get a lot of people in real estate that want to switch and get into design. And I think a lot of the things that all of us have kind of been saying today, it's really about process and how you think about design that we're looking for. The tools, the training, obviously that's super important. And, and understanding Revit, knowing InDesign and those different programs, that's obviously super helpful and useful in your getting into a job. But more importantly is, how do you think about design? So if your background was in a different type of design is design. It doesn't matter what it is. There's a problem that we're trying to solve for a client. And if you can show that this was my client, this was my problem, and this is how I solved that problem, and you can clearly communicate that visually, audibly, right? Like in your interview, if you can speak to articulately to say, this is how I did this, these were the steps, that's going to go a long way. I think almost every employer is going to be willing to take a chance on someone that feels special and feels like a good fit for the office. So I definitely wouldn't shy away from doing that, making that shift. I'm sure probably everyone on this call has done that at least once or twice in their career. So definitely don't be afraid to take a risk and just visually tell your story of what it is that process of where you want to go and why. I think it's also important to understand, why are you making this shift? So all of a sudden that becomes part of your portfolio or your interview process too, is what you're looking for.
I like that.
Ashley, I love that answer. Here's what I would say to this question, and I think it builds on, maybe it goes farther. Number one, if you are making a pivot, if you're thinking of it as a shift, I would suggest you think of it as just a movement within space fusion, right? It's all space typologies. It's all a design response to a problem, a question, a ask, a program, a directive. But what I would say is, if your portfolio is heavily weighted in one typology, but you really are either interviewing for, pursuing, and want to make that change, then you need to create something that represents your sensibilities. So let's say you're a healthcare designer and you're looking to pivot to hospitality and sports and rec. Or you're a workplace designer and you're looking to pivot to healthcare or experience design, right? Put together a one-pager that says, these are my sensibilities about this other typology, this other project type that I am talented and capable of creating to and solving for. Here's my sensibilities around that, and here's why. Because if someone's going to take a chance, hire you with little experience in that specific thing, but you're clearly creative, help them hire you. Put the placemat out, put the postcard out that talks about your sensibilities. And number two, as you go through your portfolio, if you're sharing project stories, point out those sensibilities and how they manifested themselves in those projects. So if there's a great workplace project and you really took a hospitality approach to the amenities for grab and go, arrival, multi-purpose, pantry cafe, right? Exterior lounges, talk about where those precedents came from and how they reinforce your interest in the pivot of those sensibilities. There's a little bit of homework and script there, but if you're creative, it should be a fun exercise.
Interesting.
I think that design is design. So in any type of project, I think healthcare is one. Healthcare has, right, you can very easily tie that to hospitality and thinking, but it's about the thinking and the process of how am I thinking about these spaces in a particular way. So rather than focusing on those clinical spaces, maybe you really maybe you worked on, like Bill said, the amenity spaces where you did a grab and go or a coffee bar or a conference center. A lot of healthcare has conference centers. And so that you could bring into a workplace discussion about how you were thinking about, how people are moving in and out of those conference spaces. You can talk about the life safety of convertible conference rooms and things like that. So definitely dive into how your experience translates into where you want to go.
Yeah, tailor the story to really fit where you're wanting to go. I like that. Yeah, because I feel like that would be, if I put myself in the shoes of someone trying to switch like that, healthcare to hospitality, that would be a big, I think I would be scared, be like, I don't have, those wow hospitality pieces to show, but it would be interesting to sort of change how the story is told.
Yeah, I mean, maybe the word tailor in that question, Kelly, and to the group, maybe that word tailor is just more about taking that word out of the sentence and change it to emphasis, right? Because to what Megan said earlier, bring forth that other part of yourself, your personality that's really interested in pivoting to that kind of work.
Right.
And if, you're going, maybe like a lot of times we see designers going into the vendor market or vice versa, right? I think then the conversation is about client interaction. What are some of the things you've done with clients that are unique that can translate? So it's just about being creative and trying to figure out what from your previous experience can really shape how you can grow in a new discipline.
Interesting. So along the lines of kind of telling your story along this portfolio, if it is physical or a website, do you feel there is too many projects or not enough projects to put in a portfolio? Is there really a perfect amount, or could you only include one project and tell, the whole story from concept development, and that would be enough?
I don't think there's a right amount. I think there's a wrong amount, right? I think that however much time you have to think about that. And then how can you hit these highlights? So just driving back home the point of storytelling, narrative, who are you? How do you think about body, outwards, and space? So, I mean, I think that 3 to 5 is a good ballpark, but I don't think that is a hard and fast rule. And I do think that if you can get it done in one project, that is something that is worth trying. I think that sometimes that can just limit, because you just can't, especially if you're like a student, right? You can't really do everything in the same capacity for each project. So it can be difficult then to show some of those different ways of thinking if you're just focusing on your thesis or you're just focusing on capstone. So I actually think that can be a little bit of a disservice. But again, I think that, like I said, there's no right way to do it. So it's definitely something that I could see working with the right project and the right designer.
But Megan, your answer is quite good, right? There's the insightful thing about your answer is, if there's a feature project, if there's one project, and it might even be the one that is the newest, that has been informed by the most educational experience, right? So it might be your thesis. It might be a large project towards the latter part of your education career. But if one project can capture all the elements of the process, and then we see postcards of it in the others. It also takes the burden off the candidate to have to explain every detail in the process of every project, but it might allow them to talk about a different emphasis in the other projects. The thing that we look for is one whole process project, but then we look for variety. We're really curious about the one-pagers, the snippets. Oh, I pulled this out of this project because we designed this unique thing, and actually we mocked it up and then we 3D printed it and we put it in the scale model. That gave huge insight into the person's willingness to experiment real time at smaller scale with 3-dimensional objects. We didn't see it in the other work. And we're like, oh, are you doing that in everything? And we're like, oh, pretty much. So to find those kernels of beauty, of talent about a person are really important.
And then to speak to the thesis or capstone or most recent project taking up the majority, if you also think about collaboration as being a key component of the modern workplace, thinking about, you know, if your thesis or capstone didn't involve anything collaborative, then of course the idea that you would want to pull something from a studio or project where you were working more on a team, then I think that those, you know, questions that you're asking yourself, you know, how am I showing myself in this interview, and is this particular project capturing that, will help you decide if you need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on.
Yeah, I think, Megan, your point that there's no right answer, but there are some wrong answers is a really great point. I would say to that, in terms of, you don't need to show your freshman year projects through your senior year projects. You don't need to do that. Pick the projects that best showcase your design thinking, who you are, and that you are excited about, that you're passionate about, because when you feel that about the work you're doing, that's not only going to come through in the pages that you're putting together, but when you talk to that project in the interview process. You don't want to put up a project that you're like, oh, I hate this project, you know, because it's going to come across in the way you talk about it, and that will be a negative. So I think that, you know, just include projects as much as possible that you just want to talk about, really.
I think it's different. You know, obviously we have some students on today and we have some, you know, more professionals on today. So I think it's different when you're a student. You know, I remember you would get a one pager about who your client is or what the blurb is, and then you'd have to create from that. So maybe as a student, you might have more works to share versus a professional. Maybe you minimize it down to like your top big wow designs that you tell more of the longer months, years story it took to get to the complete, you know, project.
Now, Kelly, there's something else that's occurring to my thinking as a result of listening to you and Ashley and Megan talk in this last question, and it goes like this. I think there's an accompaniment to the portfolio, right? Maybe it's a script, maybe it's storylines, maybe it's headlines, but I would really urge, and I bet everybody would agree with this, candidates, that before you're out on the trail, virtually or otherwise interviewing, I think it's important to step back from one's work, whether it's an educational body, 3 years experience, 10 years experience, and step back and be able to say, in my work with whatever, teams, collaboratively, in studios, there are a number of themes that have emerged in the work that I've done and the work that I've studied, and they're about contrast, sustainability, the relationship between curves and orthogonal planes. I think it's important to understand your own ethos as a designer, be able to very simply express it verbally, and that it's a way of accompanying the work. But, you know, we all want to know what floats the boat of a person. What is it about crafting, creating space that makes it the choice, that a candidate's belief in themselves? Is it they're going to do this, or they do this better than anything else they possibly do in the world, and they've chosen this career path? And I think it's important to give yourself the gift of writing a script, jotting down some headlines, stepping back from one's work, and really knowing, identifying to oneself what themes spatially you are passionate about, and be able to convey that, because very often it looks like a pattern language in the work, which is not to say that it all looks the same, but this gets into, I think, a level of elevating one's own game to really understand who you are as a designer. I'll stop there because I want the others to comment on that.
I don't know if I have anything to follow up with.
Set you up. Set you
Yeah.
up.
I mean, I would piggyback on that would be a key differentiator, right? We're all looking for this thing. What can I put in my portfolio that's going to help me stand out? But I think, you know, Bill's touching on the fact that it really isn't one thing, but if you can step back and reflect on your body of work and then articulate that is absolutely a differentiator. Very rarely are maybe students and young designers thinking about doing that or thinking about that as a powerful differentiator. So I think that was a really great point.
Well, finding your voice, right? Because if you look at the level of portfolio development in the last couple of years and compare it to what it looked like 12 years ago, the impact of technology and the increase of three-dimensional environments in the built world have got to be informing what inspires candidates and people at the grade school level and high school level to choose these career paths. And so it makes me wonder if really part of that, if the work looks that solved, is the voice behind it as strong as the resolve that's in that work? And I think that's the test. That's the challenge, and it's one that nobody should shirk from.
My portfolio, you know, definitely would not stand up to what I've seen in the last few years. My watercolors don't really impress as much now.
But you know, Kelly, yeah, it cannot be about that. If the content is solid, it doesn't matter what it looks like.
That's the secret.
I like it. Thanks for making me feel better.
Yes.
So like Megan was saying, with, you know, there is definitely too many projects to put in. There's a good ratio. Are there red flags? So what is something that you've seen that is a no-no, or that you would tell to students as, you know, avoid these when you are putting together your portfolio? Any that come to mind?
I'll start with that. Embellishments, they're not necessary. You know, little graphic borders, little picture illustrations to go by your name. Like, never underestimate the power of white space. Everything on that portfolio should be thoughtful, why it's there, what its purpose is, and how it's helping tell the story. So I would say those embellishments, the borders, just let them go.
Yeah, I think that's a good, go ahead, Bill.
No, don't overlabel things.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. Piggybacking on what Ashley was saying, you know, you really don't want to be spending your time on these other things. Your work is inherently graphic. So if it is not doing its job on the page, then really your energy should be spent working on that and figuring out how it can come to life versus trying to bandage it with things that are extraneous, right? So I agree with that. Nothing extraneous, no embellishments, don't overlabel. Some things are very obvious, and don't overcrowd things, right? So Ashley said, don't underestimate the power of white space. You can see this on any website from our top 100. All the publications that they put out are great resources for breathing room and letting stuff be really big. So I think that those things are red flags for me. No process is a huge red flag, right? Trying to hide behind final renderings and drawings. And then things that are haphazard, right? Because I think this goes back to sensibility. We don't do that in space. Things either line up or don't line up based on your thought process and what should happen. So layouts kind of link to that ability to laterally move from one place to another.
I think a couple others are don't exclude mood board, but don't overdo it. We don't want to see 10 mood boards for one project. It may be a rich, diverse project with a lot of areas, but I think having one or two key mood boards that talk about materiality and experience scale, right, are great. I think the one thing that we see less and less that we'd like to understand more of is creating visuals that speak to context, right? The structural grid, the position of a building, exterior influences on both a building and the interior of a building from the surrounding area, regionalism, right? How does that come into play to an influence? So we're curious about precedents and influences and wish we could see more about that, which is really part of discovery, but it's a step beyond mood and ambiance, right? And I think the other thing that we see is that we don't want to know a lot about materiality, but I think you have to have some sensibilities around foundation materials that support a big idea, right? We don't need to see every upholstery and every finish of every suggested piece of millwork, casework, floor, etc. But sometimes a project really revolves around a key group of anchor materials that are the foundation, and they somehow relate conceptually to the very beginning of the project.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, we actually have only a couple minutes left here. So thank you everyone for joining today. And thank you panelists. I hope that everyone left with something insightful to add or delete from their portfolio. Katie, I will hand it over to you.
Okay, great. I just wanted to thank you all again for participating in today's session. I know myself, I walked away with several morsels of good ideas for, well, more probably what not to do than what to do. I don't know what that says about me, but thank you so much for your insight. I just want to wrap up this session by saying thank you to the panelists for participating, as well as give a small plug to our upcoming SoCal IIDA events. We have the Advocacy CEU and Terrarium Making coming up on Earth Day, April 22nd. Also, the San Diego City Center is hosting a virtual product flyby on the 27th. Followed by the next two sessions of the SPF series, where we'll be talking about the artfully crafted resume and the business of the personal brand. So hopefully we'll see you on the future events. Thanks so much for joining us today, and thanks everyone for your participation.
Thanks, you.
Thanks, everybody. Good luck.
Bye.
Bye.